The morning sun cast golden rays through the massive glass domes of the Eden Project in Cornwall, England. Margaret Windsor, known to most as simply Maggie, adjusted her simple blue cardigan and checked her watch. Today was different from any other day in her 78 years of life. Today, she would celebrate her birthday in the most unusual way possible. Maggie had always been fascinated by plants and gardens. As a young woman, she had dreamed of becoming a botanist, but life had taken her down a different path entirely. She married young, raised 3 children, and spent most of her adult life working as a librarian in a small town outside London. Her husband passed away 5 years ago, and since then, she had thrown herself into her love of gardening and nature. 6 months earlier, something extraordinary had happened. Maggie received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was crisp and official, explaining that extensive genealogical research had revealed she was the rightful heir to a forgotten branch of the royal family. Apparently, her great-great-grandfather had been a distant cousin to Queen Victoria, and through a series of unusual circumstances involving missing heirs and forgotten documents, she was now technically entitled to a minor royal title. The whole thing seemed like a dream, or perhaps an elaborate joke. Maggie had laughed at first, certain someone was playing a prank on her. But the lawyers were serious, the documents were real, and the paperwork was extensive. Within weeks, she found herself officially recognized as the Duchess of Cornish Gardens, a title that had been dormant for over a century. The media had picked up the story, fascinated by this ordinary grandmother who had suddenly become royalty. Newspapers called her the People's Duchess and the Gardening Queen. Unlike traditional royalty, Maggie refused to change her simple lifestyle. She kept living in her modest cottage, tending to her vegetable garden, and volunteering at the local community center. When her birthday approached, various organizations reached out, wanting to host grand celebrations. The Eden Project in Cornwall made the most appealing offer. They suggested she celebrate her special day surrounded by the incredible biodomes that housed plants from around the world. It seemed perfect for someone who had spent her life loving nature. Tim Richardson, the event coordinator at Eden Project, was both excited and nervous about hosting such an unusual royal celebration. He had been working at the attraction for 12 years and had organized hundreds of events, but nothing quite like this. The challenge was creating something special for someone who clearly valued authenticity over pomp and ceremony. She specifically requested that we keep things simple. Tim explained to his team during their planning meeting. No fancy decorations, no red carpets, just a celebration that honors her love of plants and gardens. The team brainstormed ideas that would make the day memorable while respecting Maggie's down-to-earth personality. The Eden Project staff had grown fond of their unusual royal visitor during the planning process. Maggie had visited twice to discuss the arrangements, and each time she had spent hours exploring the different biomes, asking detailed questions about the plants, and showing genuine interest in the conservation work being done. She was nothing like the formal, distant royalty they had imagined. Sarah Mitchell, the head botanist, particularly enjoyed talking with Maggie. She knows more about British wildflowers than most of our train guides, Sarah told her colleagues. And she has this wonderful way of making everyone feel comfortable. Yesterday, I saw her chatting with the maintenance crew about their tomato plants at home. As the birthday celebration approached, word spread throughout the local community. Unlike typical royal events that required security clearances and formal invitations, Maggie had requested that local families be invited to join the festivities. Children from nearby schools would be welcome, along with gardening clubs from across Cornwall. The most interesting aspect of the celebration would be the birthday cake. Eden Project's chef, Roberto Silva, had created something truly spectacular. The cake was designed to look like the Eden Project itself, complete with edible dome structures made from sugarwork. It stood 3 feet tall and was decorated with edible flowers and miniature sugar sculptures representing different ecosystems. However, there was one element of the celebration that had everyone talking. Among the items that came with Maggie's newly recognized royal status was a collection of ceremonial objects that had belonged to her ancestor. Most of these were typical royal artifacts, ornate cups, decorative plates, and formal documents. But one item stood out as particularly unusual. The ceremonial sword was enormous, nearly 4 feet long, with an elaborately decorated handle. According to historical records, it had been used in various royal ceremonies over the centuries, though its exact purpose had been lost to time. The sword was beautiful, but completely impractical for modern use, far too large and heavy for any normal activity. When the royal collection was presented to Maggie, she had laughed at the sight of the massive sword. "What on earth am I supposed to do with this?" she had asked the curator. The man had explained its historical significance and suggested it could be displayed in her home or donated to a museum. But Maggie had a different idea entirely. If she was going to embrace this unexpected royal role, she decided she might as well do it with a sense of humor. When Tim from Eden Project asked if there were any special traditions she wanted to include in her birthday celebration, she mentioned the sword. "I was thinking," she had said with a mischievous smile, "what if we used it to cut the birthday cake? It would certainly be memorable, and it might be the first useful thing that sword has done in centuries." Tim had been surprised by the suggestion, but immediately loved the idea. It was exactly the kind of unexpected, delightful twist that would make this celebration unique. He began making arrangements to ensure the sword could be safely transported and used during the cake-cutting ceremony. Local newspapers caught wind of the unusual plan and began running stories about the queen who will use a giant sword to cut her birthday cake. The story captured people's imagination, combining the unexpected nature of Maggie's royal status with her refreshingly unconventional approach to tradition. As her birthday morning arrived, Maggie felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She had never been the center of attention like this before, and part of her wondered if she was making a mistake. But as she looked out at her garden and thought about the day ahead, she felt confident in her decision to celebrate in a way that felt authentic to who she was. The Eden Project was preparing for what would likely be one of their most memorable events ever. Staff members were making final preparations, ensuring everything would go smoothly for their special royal guest, who preferred to be called simply Maggie, and who was about to make history with a very large sword and a very impressive cake. The Eden Project buzzed with unusual energy as visitors began arriving for what everyone was calling the most unconventional royal birthday party in British history. Unlike typical royal events held in palaces or formal venues, this celebration was taking place among towering tropical plants and exotic flowers from around the world. Families from across Cornwall had driven hours to attend, many bringing homemade gifts and handwritten cards for Maggie. Children pressed their noses against the glass walls of the Mediterranean biome, pointing excitedly at the olive trees and lavender bushes while their parents discussed the remarkable story of an ordinary woman who had become royalty overnight. Emma Thompson, a teacher from St. Ives, had brought her class of 8-year-olds on a special field trip. "The children have been so excited about meeting a real queen," she explained to other visitors. "But they're even more excited that she's not scary or formal like the queens in their storybooks. She seems like someone's grandmother who just happens to wear a crown." The Eden Project staff had transformed the central area of the rainforest biome into a celebration space. Instead of formal decorations, they had created natural arrangements using the existing plants and flowers. Colorful banners made from recycled materials hung between the trees, and tables were set up beneath the canopy of exotic foliage. Roberto, the head chef, was making final adjustments to the spectacular birthday cake. The 3-foot-tall creation had taken his team 3 days to complete, and it truly was a work of art. The edible domes sparkled under the biome's lighting system, and the tiny sugar flowers looked almost real enough to fool the botanical experts walking by. "I have been cooking for 20 years, Roberto told his assistant while carefully adding final touches, "but I have never made a cake that will be cut with a sword. This is definitely going into my cookbook someday." He stepped back to admire their work, feeling proud of what they had accomplished. The ceremonial sword had arrived earlier that morning, transported in a special case by representatives from the Royal Collection Trust. Tim Richardson supervised as they carefully unpacked the massive weapon, checking to ensure it was clean and safe for the unusual task ahead. The sword was even more impressive in person than in photographs. The blade gleamed despite its age, and the handle was decorated with intricate engravings depicting various flowers and plants. It's almost like it was meant for this moment, observed Sarah Mitchell, the head botanist, as she examined the floral motifs carved into the metal. Several security experts had been consulted about the safety aspects of using such a large weapon to cut a cake. After careful consideration, they determined that with proper precautions and assistance, it could be done safely. A special platform was constructed to hold the cake at the right height, and trained staff would help guide the sword during the cutting ceremony. Media representatives began gathering as the morning progressed. Unlike typical royal events covered by formal court reporters, this story had attracted journalists from gardening magazines, local newspapers, and even food bloggers interested in the unusual cake-cutting method. The atmosphere was relaxed and friendly, more like a community festival than a royal ceremony. Margaret Windsor arrived at Eden Project just before noon, traveling her own modest car rather than an official royal vehicle. She wore a simple floral dress and comfortable walking shoes, looking exactly like someone's favorite grandmother heading to a family gathering. The only hint of her royal status was a small silver tiara that had belonged to her great-great-grandmother. As word spread that Maggie had arrived, visitors began gathering in the central area. Children waved excitedly while adults applauded politely. Maggie seemed genuinely surprised and pleased by the warm reception, stopping frequently to chat with families and admire the elaborate decorations the staff had created. "This is absolutely beautiful," she told him as he gave her a tour of the celebration area. "I never imagined my birthday could be celebrated somewhere so magical. Thank you for making this feel so welcoming and natural." Her genuine appreciation was evident as she examined the cake and expressed amazement at the detailed work that had gone into creating it. The formal program began with a welcome speech from Dr. Joe Elworthy, the Eden Project's chief executive. She spoke about the connection between Maggie's love of gardening and Eden's mission to demonstrate the importance of plants to human survival. "We are honored to host someone who understands that royalty is really about serving others and caring for the natural world," she said to enthusiastic applause. Local school children performed songs they had written about gardens and growing things. Their voices echoed beautifully in the high-ceiling biome as they sang about flowers blooming and trees growing tall. Maggie watched with obvious delight, clapping along and occasionally wiping away tears of joy. The highlight of the musical program was a special performance by the Cornwall Youth Orchestra. They had prepared a medley of pieces inspired by nature, including a beautiful arrangement of the lark ascending that seemed perfectly suited to the lush surroundings of the rainforest biome. As the formal program concluded, attention turned to the centerpiece of the celebration, the cake-cutting ceremony. The massive ceremonial sword was ceremoniously brought forward by 2 Eden Project staff members, who presented it to Maggie with appropriate gravity. "I have to admit," Maggie said to the assembled crowd, her voice amplified by a small microphone, "when I woke up this morning, I never thought I would be holding a sword that weighs more than my garden spade. But if being royal has taught me anything in these past few months, it's that life is full of unexpected adventures." The crowd laughed appreciatively as Tim and Roberto positioned themselves on either side of Maggie to assist with the unusual cake-cutting process. The sword was indeed heavy, far too heavy for someone her age to handle alone. But with careful coordination, they were confident the ceremony could proceed safely. Photographers captured the remarkable scene as the newly minted royal prepared to cut her birthday cake with a weapon that had probably never been used for anything so practical in its entire history. Children pressed forward to get a better view, while parents held up phones to record the unprecedented moment. "This sword has probably attended many royal ceremonies over the centuries," Maggie announced to the crowd. "But I bet it has never had the honor of cutting such a magnificent cake. Today, we're going to make some new history together. The moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. Maggie stood before the magnificent cake, the ceremonial sword gleaming in her hands with Tim and Roberto positioned carefully on either side to provide support and guidance. The crowd fell silent, creating a hushed anticipation that filled the enormous biome. "Well," Maggie said with a grin that reached her eyes, "I suppose this is not exactly what my etiquette lessons covered." The crowd erupted in laughter, and even the formal photographers couldn't help but smile at her infectious humor. She adjusted her grip on the ornate handle, feeling the weight of centuries of tradition in her hands. The first cut was ceremonial, a careful slice through the top tier of the cake that represented the rainforest biome. Working together, the three of them guided the massive blade through the elaborate sugarwork. There was a satisfying sound as the sword cleanly separated a generous piece of cake, revealing the delicious layers inside. "Success!" called out Roberto, beaming with pride as he saw that his creation had survived its encounter with medieval weaponry. The crowd burst into enthusiastic applause and cheers. Children jumped up and down excitedly while their parents captured photos of the historic moment. But the cake-cutting ceremony was just the beginning of the surprises planned for Maggie's special day. As staff members began carefully slicing and serving pieces of the elaborate cake to guests, Dr. Elworthy approached with a special announcement. "Your Majesty," she said formally, causing Maggie to laugh and wave her hand dismissively. "We have one more birthday surprise for you. The Eden Project would like to offer you the opportunity to plant the first tree in our new heritage garden, a special section dedicated to preserving rare varieties of British plants." Maggie's eyes lit up with genuine excitement. This was exactly the kind of gift that meant something to her. "You might get to actually plant something? With my own hands? This is better than any crown jewels." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and the crowd moved eagerly toward the designated planting area. The Heritage Garden space had been carefully prepared with a young oak tree, a sapling grown from an acorn taken from a 1,000-year-old tree on the grounds of Windsor Castle. The symbolism was perfect, connecting Maggie's newly discovered royal heritage with her lifelong love of gardening. Emma Thompson's class of 8-year-olds gathered around as Maggie knelt beside the small tree, not caring that she was getting dirt on her dress. "This is how you really connect with the earth," she told the children. "You have to be willing to get your hands dirty." The children watched with fascination as she carefully placed the sapling in the prepared hole, gently spreading the roots and packing soil around the base. Several of the young students asked if they could help, and soon Maggie was surrounded by eager helpers, all taking turns adding handfuls of earth to the planting site. "Every tree starts small like this," she explained to her young assistants. "But with care and patience, it will grow tall and strong. Maybe someday your own grandchildren will play in its shade." The simple wisdom of her words resonated with both the children and the adults watching the impromptu gardening lesson. News of the unconventional royal celebration was spreading far beyond the Eden Project. Social media platforms were filled with photos and videos of the sword-wielding queen cutting her enormous cake. The hashtag #SwordCakeQueen began trending as people shared their delight at seeing royalty presented in such an approachable, humorous way. Television news programs picked up the story, with reporters commenting on how refreshing it was to see a royal celebration that felt genuine and accessible. "This is exactly what modern monarchy should look like," commented one royal expert on BBC News. "Connected to real people and real values, not just ceremony and tradition." International media also took notice of the unusual story. American networks ran features about Britain's most unconventional queen, while newspapers across Europe covered the celebration as an example of how traditional institutions could evolve to remain relevant in contemporary society. But Maggie remained focused on the people around her, seemingly unaware of the broader media attention her birthday was generating. She spent the afternoon moving through the different biomes, chatting with families, answering children's questions about plants, and sharing stories about her own garden back home. In the Mediterranean biome, she encountered a group of elderly visitors from a local gardening club who had traveled together to attend the celebration. These were clearly her people, passionate gardeners who understood the joy of watching things grow. She spent nearly an hour discussing pruning techniques, sharing tips about composting, and listening to their stories about prize-winning roses and stubborn vegetable patches. "You know," said Harold Pemberton, an 82-year-old member of the Penzance Garden Society, "I was worried that becoming royal might change you. But you're still just a gardener who happens to have a fancy title. That's exactly as it should be." The afternoon program included several special presentations that highlighted the connection between gardening and community service. Local school groups had prepared displays showing their own gardening projects, from rooftop gardens in urban areas to butterfly sanctuaries created behind their schools. Maggie examined each display with genuine interest, asking detailed questions and offering encouragement to the young gardeners. She was particularly impressed by a project from a secondary school in Truro that had created a food garden to supply their school's lunch program. "This is what royalty should really be about," she told the students who had created the project. "Finding ways to serve your community and make life better for others. You are all showing true leadership." The teenagers beamed with pride at her recognition of their hard work. As the celebration continued, it became clear that something special was happening. This wasn't just a birthday party or even just an unusual royal event. It was becoming a demonstration of how traditions could be honored while still feeling fresh and relevant. The ceremonial sword, which had begun the day as a symbol of ancient royal authority, had been transformed into something much more meaningful, a tool for bringing people together, creating laughter, and making memories. The massive weapon now rested safely in its case, having completed what was probably the most useful task of its long ceremonial career. Eden Project staff began preparing for the final phase of the celebration, which would include the presentation of special gift from the local community and a closing ceremony in the outdoor gardens. The day had exceeded everyone's expectations, creating the kind of positive, joyful atmosphere that would be remembered and talked about for years to come. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the Eden Project's outdoor gardens, the celebration moved into its final phase. The transition from the enclosed biomes to the open-air spaces created a natural shift in the day's energy, allowing for more intimate interactions between Maggie and her guests. The outdoor area had been transformed into a community gathering space, with hay bales arranged in circles for seating and long tables displaying the most remarkable collection of homemade gifts anyone had ever seen at a royal celebration. Local families had spent weeks preparing presents that reflected both their personal talents and their appreciation for their unusual new royal neighbor. Mrs. Agnes Crowley, a 74-year-old quilter from Bodmin, had created a magnificent wall hanging that depicted the Eden Project's biomes surrounded by traditional Cornish gardens. Each tiny stitch represented hours of careful work, and the piece told the story of how modern conservation efforts could work alongside traditional farming and gardening practices. "I started working on this the day I heard about your birthday celebration," Mrs. Crowley explained as she presented the quilt to Maggie. "I wanted to create something that honored both your love of gardening and your connection to Cornwall." Maggie examined the intricate needlework with obvious admiration, pointing out specific details and asking about the techniques used to create different effects. A group of local woodworkers had collaborated to create a beautiful garden bench carved from storm-damaged oak trees that have fallen on National Trust properties throughout Cornwall. The bench was inscribed with a quote from Vita Sackville West: "The longer I live, the more convinced I become that the only thing worth pursuing is the creation of beauty." Children from a nearby primary school in St. Blaise had created a collection of painted stones, each one depicting a different flower that could be found in Cornish gardens. The stones were intended to be placed throughout Maggie's garden at home, creating a colorful reminder of her special birthday celebration. 10-year-old Sophie Martinez had painted a particularly beautiful stone featuring a detailed rose surrounded by the words, for our gardening queen." When she presented it to Maggie, she explained that she had practiced painting roses for weeks to get the petals just right. "My grandmother taught me that anything worth doing is worth doing well," Sophie said seriously. The most ambitious gift came from the students and staff at a local agricultural college. They had propagated hundreds of seedlings from heritage varieties of vegetables and flowers that had historical connections to Cornwall. The collection included rainbow chard descended from plants grown in monastery gardens, purple sprouting broccoli that had been cultivated in the region for over 200 years, and wildflower seeds saved from meadows that had never been treated with modern chemicals. These plants carry the genetic memory of centuries of Cornish gardening, explained Professor James Henley as he walked Maggie through the extensive collection. "We thought you might enjoy growing some living history in your own garden." The professor's passion for agricultural heritage was evident as he described each variety and its significance to the region's farming traditions. Maggie was clearly overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness and effort that had gone into each gift. She spent considerable time with each presenter, asking questions about their work and expressing genuine appreciation for their creativity and generosity. Her responses were far from the polite acknowledgments typically expected at royal events. These were real conversations between people who shared common interests and values. The formal gift presentation was followed by what organizers called Garden Stories, an opportunity for attendees to share their own gardening experiences and memories. The idea had emerged spontaneously during the planning process when someone suggested that the celebration should include voices from the community, not just presentations to the guest of honor. Martha Henderson, an elderly woman from Falmouth, told the story of the Victory Garden she had maintained during World War II, describing how her family had survived difficult times by growing their own vegetables and sharing surplus produce with neighbors who were struggling. Her voice carried the weight of lived experience as she described the satisfaction of feeding her family with food she had grown herself. A young father, named David Collins, shared his experience of creating a garden with his autistic son, explaining how the predictable rhythms of planting and harvesting had provided structure and calm in their daily routine. "Working in the soil together has given us a way to communicate that doesn't require words," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The stories continued as the afternoon progressed, creating an unexpected but powerful tapestry of experiences that connected gardening to broader themes of resilience, community, healing, and hope. Maggie listened to each story with complete attention, occasionally asking follow-up questions or sharing related experiences from her own life. As the storytelling session concluded, Tim Richardson approached the group with news that the day's activities had generated considerable media attention beyond what anyone had anticipated. Television news crews from London were requesting interviews. Newspapers were preparing feature stories, and social media engagement had reached levels typically associated with major royal announcements. "We've received calls from gardening programs wanting to feature your story," Tim explained, "and several publishers have inquired about book deals. There seems to be enormous public interest in your approach to being royal." He paused before continuing. "The question is whether you want to pursue any of these opportunities." Maggie considered the question carefully before responding. "I think the important thing is making sure that any attention we receive is used to promote the things we care about: gardening, community, environmental conservation, and bringing people together. If talking to reporters or writing books can help more people discover the joy of growing things, then perhaps it's worth considering." Her thoughtful response reflected the same practical wisdom she had shown throughout the day. She understood that her unusual position gave her a platform that could be used for positive purposes, but she was clearly determined to maintain control over how that platform was used. As evening approached, the celebration began to wind down naturally. Families with young children started making their way back to the car parks, while others lingered to continue conversations that had developed during the day's activities. The atmosphere remained warm and relaxed, with none of the formal urgency that typically marks the end of official royal events. The Eden Project staff began the process of carefully packing the ceremonial sword for its return to the royal collection, though several people suggested it should remain on permanent display as a reminder of the day when royalty and cake cutting were revolutionized simultaneously. Roberto supervised the careful preservation of pieces of the elaborate birthday cake, ensuring that samples would be saved for the Eden Project's archives and that enough remained to send home with Maggie for her to share with neighbors who had been unable to attend the celebration. As the sun began to set over the Cornish countryside, casting a golden glow over the Eden Project's distinctive domes, it was clear that something significant had happened. This had been more than just an unusual birthday party. It had been a demonstration of how tradition could evolve while maintaining its essential meaning and value. 3 months after the remarkable birthday celebration at Eden Project, the ripple effects of that extraordinary day continued to spread across the United Kingdom and beyond. What had started as one woman's unconventional approach to royal duty had evolved into something much larger and more significant than anyone could have anticipated. Maggie had returned to her modest cottage in the Cotswolds, but her quiet life had been permanently transformed. The small village of Upper Thornfield, population 347, had suddenly found itself at the center of international attention. Tour buses now made regular stops to see the house where the Sword Cake Queen lives, and the local post office reported a dramatic increase in mail addressed simply to the gardening Queen, England. The cottage itself remained largely unchanged, though Maggie had created a special display area for some of the remarkable gifts she had received at Eden Project. Mrs. Crowley's quilt hung prominently in her sitting room, and the carved wooden bench had been placed in a position of honor beside her prize-winning rose garden. The heritage seeds from the agricultural college had been planted throughout her property, creating what visitors were already calling the most historically significant vegetable garden in Britain. Maggie tended these plants with particular care, understanding that she was now the guardian of genetic material that represented centuries of agricultural tradition. Media interest had indeed continued well beyond the initial celebration. Maggie had accepted selected interviews and speaking opportunities, always with the condition that the focus remain on gardening, community service, and environmental conservation rather than on her personal story or royal status. Her first television appearance had been on the BBC's Gardener's World, where she demonstrated proper composting techniques and discussed the importance of preserving heritage plant varieties. The episode received the highest ratings in the program's history, and viewer feedback revealed that people were particularly drawn to her practical, down-to-earth approach to both gardening and royalty. A major London publisher had approached Maggie about writing a book, and after considerable thought, she had agreed to work on Growing Community, a gardening queen's guide to cultivating connection. The book would combine practical gardening advice with stories from her birthday celebration and reflections on how traditional institutions could evolve to serve contemporary needs. The Eden Project had experienced its own transformation following the celebration. Visitor numbers had increased dramatically, with people specifically requesting to see where the Queen cut her cake with a sword. The Heritage Garden, where Maggie had planted the oak sapling, had become one of the most popular attractions on the site. Tim Richardson had been promoted to Director of Community Engagement, a new position created specifically to build on the success of Maggie's celebration. His first major project was developing a series of Royal Garden Days that would bring together local communities for celebrations that combined environmental education with traditional festivities. The ceremonial sword had indeed found a permanent home at Eden Project, displayed in a special case that told the story of the day when ancient ceremony met modern cake cutting. The display had become a favorite photo opportunity for visitors, many of whom posed pretending to cut imaginary cakes with imaginary swords. Roberto had parlayed his cake-creating fame into a new career as a specialist in ceremonial confections. He had received commissions from organizations around the world wanting to create elaborate cakes for their own unique celebrations. His techniques for making sugar sculptures sturdy enough to survive sword cutting have been featured in professional pastry magazines. The broader impact of Maggie's approach to royalty had been felt throughout the British establishment. Other members of minor royal families had begun adopting more accessible, community-focused approaches to their public roles. The phrase "pulling a Maggie" had entered popular usage to describe any situation where someone chose authentic, practical action over formal ceremony. Educational institutions had embraced the story as a teaching tool. Schools across the country were using the celebration as a starting point for lessons about tradition, community service, environmental stewardship, and the power of individual action to create positive change. The agricultural college that had contributed the heritage seeds had received increased funding for their preservation programs, and several other institutions had launched similar initiatives. The renewed interest in heritage varieties had led to increased availability of unusual plants and vegetables in garden centers throughout the UK. International recognition had followed as well. Maggie had been invited to speak at environmental conferences in several European countries, where her message about connecting traditional values with contemporary environmental action had resonated strongly with audiences concerned about climate change and sustainability. The village of Upper Thornfield had embraced its new status as the home of Britain's most unconventional royal. The parish council had created a small museum displaying photographs and memorabilia from the Eden Project celebration, and the local pub had added the Sword and Crown to its menu, a dessert that featured a small chocolate sword stuck into a crown-shaped cake. Local businesses had experienced an unexpected boom as visitors came to see Maggie's village and learn more about traditional Cotswold gardening practices. The village nursery had expanded to offer specialty tours focused on heritage plants and sustainable gardening techniques. On a personal level, Maggie had found deep satisfaction in her new role, though she continued to approach it with the same practical sensibility she brought to everything else in her life. She had established the Gardening Communities Foundation, a charitable organization that provided grants and support to community gardens in underserved areas. The foundation's first major project was creating garden spaces in urban schools that lacked outdoor areas for environmental education. Working with volunteers from local gardening clubs, they had already established productive gardens at 12 schools, with plans to expand the program nationally. 1 year after the Sword Cake celebration, Eden Project announced plans for a permanent exhibition called Growing Tradition: How Heritage Connects Past and Future. The display would feature stories and artifacts from communities across Britain that had found innovative ways to preserve traditional knowledge while addressing contemporary challenges. Maggie had agreed to serve as the exhibition's patron and primary consultant, ensuring that the display would emphasize practical applications rather than mere historical curiosities. Her input had been crucial in developing interactive elements that would allow visitors to experience traditional gardening techniques for themselves. The success of the celebration had also inspired similar events around the world. Community organizations in Australia, Canada, and the United States had organized their own heritage celebrations that combined environmental education with local history and community building. As Maggie sat in her garden on a warm spring evening, exactly 1 year after the day that had changed everything, she reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point. The transformation from quiet village librarian to internationally recognized advocate for community gardening still seemed somewhat surreal, but the evidence of impact surrounded her. Letters from school children who had started gardens after hearing her speak were tucked into her gardening journal. Photographs from community garden openings around the country covered her refrigerator. Seeds and cuttings sent by gardeners from around the world filled her greenhouse. Most importantly, the spirit of that extraordinary day at Eden Project, the sense of joy, community, and connection that had emerged when tradition met innovation, continued to inspire new projects and bring people together around shared values of growth, care, and cultivation. The story of the queen who cut her birthday cake with a giant ceremonial sword had become something much larger than a single unusual event. It had become a symbol of how individuals could honor tradition while creating positive change, how institutions could evolve while maintaining their essential character, and how the simple act of growing things together could build the foundations for a more connected and sustainable world.